Well, hey folks, it's your old pal, King Waspinator, and you know what time it is.
Welcome back to Total Party Skills! Yay!
Since the cat has been let out of the bag that the good folks at Wizards of the Coast have finally earned enough experience by battling other Pokemon with Dungeons and Dragons that in a couple years D&D is going to evolve. And by having told this, I guess that kind of means that 5th edition as we know it is effectively a dead brand. So here at the end, I'm finally, I guess, giving some of my thoughts and insights on how to, look at the various races and classes from the core D&D Player's Handbook, and how to take them into consideration for the purpose of dungeon mastering. Some of the stuff I have to say about classes and races, might also, be good fodder for players to come up with ideas with how to portray their stuff. But, my videos are kind of more an emphasis on like how to build them into the setting that you're running in a way that it kind of creates like a sense of normality of what it's like to be this thing for your players by showing them in game as opposed to just handing them some reams of text or hoping that they'll sit through and read the whole book. I'm going to talk about the 4 that I would describe as the wilderness classes today. That would be the barbarians, druids, rangers, and sorcerers. Barbarians are one of those classes that you should really consider whether or not you're even going to be making available to players, and in spite of 5th edition's setup where it's play whatever combination that you want, depending on your setting. Some race combinations with barbarians don't necessarily make sense. If you're doing like a kind of post-apocalyptic Dark Ages just after the fall of civilization kind of setting, similar to what I do in like my Orc and Bone setting, then having stuff like tiefling barbarians and half-elf barbarians and stuff like that might make a little bit more sense. But in your average medieval style D&D setting, are you really going to see a high elf barbarian? No. They're good for humans. Dwarves, especially hill dwarves, seem to kind of fit a barbarian mold. I generally would actually try to steer Wood Elf players towards taking Barbarian as an option. If you want to bring more of a Wild Elf kind of vibe to your Wood Elf and not just be some Legolas wannabe. Gnomes, maybe like deep gnomes. What kind of settings are gnomes going to be barbarians? Like I said, if you're having some sort of like sudden recent collapse of all civilized society and this all becomes some, fantasy Mad Max free for all, then sure, some of the more cultured type races becoming barbarians in the aftermath, maybe. But I don't know. I don't really necessarily feel that they're a good fit for everything. And so when you're designing your own notes for what kind of restrictions, and I do recommend that you should have some restrictions. Regardless of what game you're playing, on exactly what players are playing, because you want to hone things down so they still have a wide amount of variety of options to choose from, no matter what. But they have some sort of theme that they all kind of hang their hook on that helps rope them together as a group. I mean, they really read more like Viking berserkers with some shamanistic potential, depending on which kind of specialization you take as they level up. Heavily influenced by, you know, like the Conan type stereotypes of what it is to be a barbarian. You know, like looking back at like what actual quote-unquote barbaric peoples of history are like, you know, how much they really fit up with that. I mean, it should be, you know, maybe perhaps more emphasis on horse riding and cavalry tactics than what you see in the D&D barbarian, which is very also similar to the next one on the wilderness class list, which is druids. They're a mishmash of a bunch of like old Euro-pagan kind of mystic stereotypes, and given the title of druid, seemingly because they plucked it out of a hat, what is actually was written of druids by contemporaries during Roman times describes them as kind of like a political priest class. Yes, you know, they did conduct religious ceremonies and rituals, but the vast bulk of the time they're doing, you know, your classic council of elders kind of work. You know, not quite kings, not quite nobles, you know, but still like, you know, a sun priest kind of caste that sits above just your common average farmer. Sacred groves and forest imagery and animals were all part of the symbolism that druids may or may not have used in their ceremonies, is more derivative of the fact that they emerged from cultures that at the time, you know, were not living in the giant stone and concrete planned cities yet. Not that they didn't have cities and agriculture, but their version of agriculture was not quite breaking down entire landscapes and kind of softcore re-terraforming it in quite the same way that the more civilized nations of the ancient world, their cities were smaller and primarily like made out of wood and stuff like that when they didn't use, you know, natural features and outcropping. It's not even like necessarily determined that they had anything to do with megalithic culture. The time period that druids were known to be around as a thing is divorced from the people who built Stonehenge and stuff like that by thousands of years. So, like, whatever connections they have are pretty nebulous. They're presented in Dungeons & Dragons as, like, these weird, you know, like, nature priests with shape-shifting abilities. It only seems in the most basic, loosest way to be based on actual knowledge of what real druids were. In many ways, they seem to be more some kind of quasi-fictional, pseudo-Wiccan kind of, you know, nature magic witchcraft kind of thing. Generally, when, you know, using them in settings, they should be treated as part of, you know, like the divine classes. They are a priestly order. You need to kind of figure out exactly how they stack into the hierarchy around, you know, the other divine classes like clerics and paladins. Even though they don't necessarily derive their spell powers from the gods, there's no reason why, you know, various druid circle cults wouldn't, you know, necessarily also venerate one or more of whatever regional gods are important to the setting. Going back to what actual druids were in the real world, you know, investing them with like priestly social ceremony kind of duties within your world's culture might be something to do. Or alternatively, you can treat them as being like the priest version of a barbarian and have them be, you know, part of the wilderness culture. Are all barbaric peoples, you know, part of the greater druidic nature worshipping kind of culture? You know, the way they're written up, there's like no way to, like, without massively revising it, to dial back some of the more kind of goofy magic things that go on with druids. I've found from myself that whenever at the times I have run 5th edition D&D and other versions of D&D in the past, I feel like it's much more likely to have someone who wants to play a druid than have someone who has to play a cleric. At least from that kind of anecdotal evidence, if they are kind of the preferred, you know, divine class for players nowadays, then, you know, you need to do a little bit more work to actually incorporate them into whatever kind of theocratic structures that are built into the, you know, world you're designing, if you're doing a homebrew or if you're trying to like modify and personalize the published setting for your own purposes. Rangers are more than just, you know, scouts and, you know, hunters and all that kind of stuff. I feel what's kind of missing from Rangers and their generic presentation is that they should be regarded as lawmen. They're wandering marshals. Even going back to the Aragorn stereotype from Lord of the Rings, you know, they're an organized group of like wilderness knights almost, who are charged, you know, with guarding the north, even if the north doesn't realize they're being guarded. Depending on the setting, you know, they can either be, you know, like an established order that has ancient roots but doesn't answer to anyone nowadays. They're kind of, at this point, just this self-sustaining, self-appointed guardians of the wilderness. Or, you know, they can actually be invested with legal authority by, you know, one of the material type kingdoms that are currently operating and control the region. Regardless, there should be some sort of organization of rangers in the world. You know, it's a bit more than just some, like I said, they're more than just like an average wilderness scout, or, you know, some guy going around hunting deer with a bow and arrow. You know, their training is a bit specialized. In terms of how they're incorporated into military structures for more kind of like war-themed campaigns, you know, fighters give you most of your range for knights and infantrymen and all that kind of stuff. If you're looking for a modern-day analog and you're not going to go with the wandering lawman kind of thing from the West kind of stuff, then you know, treating them as like, you know, special forces, Navy SEALs units of Forgotten Realms isn't necessarily a bad approach. Still kind of gives them that authoritative, we've been, you know, given authority by the king to come and secure this place, and because they have all these like subversive, sneak around, tactical kind of skills. And I mean, it comes right down to it. Some of our military special forces call themselves fucking Rangers, so, you know. Yeah, is it the most original observation of mine? I don't know. You decide in the comments below. Sorcerers kind of pop up out of random, and so there, if you're going for like an all-focused wilderness game where you're only using these 4 wilderness classes, they would be probably the magic user that best qualifies, because they can just kind of pop up out of any population at random. Their appeal is that they're very high concept kind of characters. You know, if you want to play a chaos mage or dragon-blooded thing where eventually you start to be able to grow wings and all that kind of stuff, which if you combine with a dragonborn, you know, it can lead to some like really potent power sets as you advance in things. You know, they're great for that. They have got like a elemental tempest storm themed one in one of the various side books. Of the various classes, their variety of sub-options is actually their greatest strength compared to some other classes where having all these little variants that you lean into as you level up kind of maybe detracts from just the core essence of, here's your class, get better at this class. On the other hand, like in terms of magic, you got to be way more careful about what you choose, since you have such a you know, more limited amount of spells that you learn compared to wizards or warlocks, or even some of the other non-magic classes that can gain pseudo-magic abilities as they, you know, specialize as they level up. I also find that just because various people tend to kind of think the same in terms of what spells are best, you'll probably end up finding that most people playing sorcerers will end up kind of always choosing the exact same spells as they level up because of the things listed, and you only get to choose 1 or 2. Well, I guess I'm going with the one that lets me throw the fireball that does the most damage. But yeah, as I said, if you're going for like some entirely, you know, like uncivilized Mad Max and or Stone Age kind of thing, they work with that too. The concept of furry player character races has become a little controversial. A lot of this is over kind of an assumed paranoia that the Tumblr furry crowd is going to, you know, like ruin basically everyone's games playing Loxodons and Leonin and Tabaxi and stuff like that. I'm sure there's a few of those cases out there. I would say that in all likelihood, if those people were to be playing D&D anyway, and the older versions of D&D where they didn't have animal races available, they would probably still be over-sexualizing their elves or gnomes or whatever is available there for them to play. And it's possibly just an indication that that person is not a good candidate to be a player, or at least not, you know, in a good game. You know, as game masters, we're under like no obligation at all. It's not like there's any sort of contractual relationship put upon us by purchasing these games in order for us to be able to run them. So we are quite allowed to be selective about who we want to play with, and if we want a game to have a certain tone and seriousness, then it's just some people aren't natural fits. They're free to go find other people who are of like mind to try to play, and they can have their garbage fire games all they want. Doesn't mean that you have to contaminate your own thing. However, to just reflexively reject all animal races entirely because of a few quote-unquote bad apples out there is foolish and short-sighted. The idea, for one thing, that they're like a cheap cop-out fantasy race and, you know, has no place in a game that's supposed to be about all these classic fantasy tropes. I don't know how to break this to you guys, but the presence of anthropomorphic talking animal people is rife throughout human mythology across the world, up to and including us Western European types, and way predates stuff like elves and goblins and gnomes and all that kind of shit. Some of the very oldest human art is a little tiny statue of a dude with a lion's head. These are not at all new things. If you're looking to try to create a fantasy setting that's based on a different cultural trope, the inclusion of animal races often fits really well. You know, you want to have an African setting, instead of, you know, trying to put elves and dwarves in it, you put some Leonin and Loxodon in there. You know, same thing if you want like something based on like subcontinental India, Bharat kind of a thing. You would use you know, once again, Loxodon. If you're going for something like, you know, a Japan setting, you could have the Kenku stand in as Tengu, all that kind of stuff. I mean, like, they're perfectly valid. They are also all listed as optional. For some reason, whenever anything comes out in any one of the official books, even if it's said, like, this is entirely at the Dungeon Master's, you know, option to include, for some reason, everyone just seems to just kind of feel like, oh shit, this is now in the setting and we have to work it in to everything. Minotaurs, that's an animal creature. That's present in mythology and has been used as player characters going well back all the way to AD&D and Dragonlance and such. So, like, it's not like it's some radical new thing. Oh my god, they're subverting our beloved D&D. Like, they might be, but not through animal people, so chill the fuck out. The advantage to allowing players to play beast races and to include them in the space is that they're rather easy to understand. If you have a problem, you know, where you're like, oh, my players just don't know how to play elves right, they're not getting it, you're not giving me a convincing gnome out of how you're role-playing this guy. Well, you know, animal races are a lot easier for people to get their head around. People kind of come in, like, you hear, oh, I'm going to play an elephant dude. That kind of gives you a bunch of expectations, because what you think an elephant person would be like. Same thing with lions, jaguars, raven folk. I bristle at the idea that all the animal character races need to be ejected entirely somehow. You know, like some sort of threat to the sanctity of our entirely variable, made-up fantasy worlds. You know, there is like an issue that past your core established tropes that everyone gets their head around, there's things out there in D&D and many other role-playing games that are super original, but the players, unless they themselves are just really happen to be really steeped in whatever the subject matter is, they're going to have no fucking idea what you're talking about. That's why Star Wars is one of the few like science fiction games that I think is actually good for beginning role players, because at least with Star Wars, there's a rather large chance that the player knows what a Wookiee is. If you're having to stop and like spend 20 minutes explaining the vast history and biology of some alien race just so that your players can get an idea in their head of like what the hell it's supposed to look and act like, because it's some sort of weird fleshy insect creature with 8 legs that'll flip itself back and forth, and it's got tentacles that do 2d20 damage, you know, like, we could keep it simple and stupid and keep it moving is generally always good advice for role-playing games, even with experienced players. There's a lot of shit to juggle in your head, and so the more you can find devices to simplify things, you know, even as NPCs, you know, your players are in a dark alley in a dark, mysterious city, and they see a lion guy wearing, like, desert nomad clothes, and he pulls you know, back his veil, and you see it's a fucking lion man. Now, even if that lion character is going to end up acting against type, just that description alone should inform the players, and they'll have all sorts of baggage, and they'll feel intimidated, in which case that gives you the framing to then have the lion guy be nice or trying to negotiate with them and play against what their initial assumptions is, which is going to be, oh fuck, this is going to eat us. You know, you don't necessarily get that when you tell a random new person that, oh, you see a Githzerai in the alleyway, and they're like, what? What the fuck is a Githzerai? No, Githzerai. What is that again exactly? Like an interdimensional lizard elf? Like, well, why not just have me run into an elf? Yes, if your players are all very steeped and familiar with the material, great. But we don't always get those luxuries, you know, so why give yourself a headache? You know, use stuff that people can wrap their brains around, if you want. Once again, optional being a key word in all of this. And like I said, you know, if the player is, you know, like wanting to play like their lion dude a little bit too sexualized, that's probably a sign that they're not a good fit for your group anyway, and would have done that even if they're playing a human. You could sexualize a broom. I mean, you know, anyone could go out of their way to do this kind of shit. You can't, like, throw everything out because someone might fetishize it. And also, like, learn to have a little backbone and don't allow people to just step all over you. Like, this is a role-playing game, not a playground for your sexual fetishes. Not that there's absolutely nothing wrong with sexual fetishes. We all have them. But, you know, the appropriate times and places for things. Some stuff should be kept in separate boxes.
In the distant future of 1999, Amazon time barbarians fight to liberate the women of North America against vast armies of trolls and chads under the control of the Rogan Joe. This original tabletop role-playing game is thick with 2 C's. Available now on Amazon.com and Drive-Thru RPG.
By saying these are the civilized ones, I really more mean that they're the most obviously derived from having some sort of higher civilized society. In this instance, bards, monks, paladins, and warlocks. I guess you could also potentially call them high concept, because most of these you can kind of say, or you know, if you take the classic 4 classes from the original versions of D&D, most of these classes you can kind of say are just kind of a specialized version of one of those. Depends on your point of view on things. Bards, as a DM, because this video is less so about, you know, how to play these things, but it's how to portray them as NPCs. With bards, you want to consider exactly what their occupation means in your setting. Are they just wandering musicians, and is there a bard in every tavern kind of a thing? Are there any famous bards in the setting, you know, in the way kind of like, you know, famous musicians are in the real world, kind of an analog kind of thing? You know, do bards, you know, form bands together, or are bards kind of scattered, wandering, leaf-in-the-wind troubadours, wandering from place to place, who occasionally just get into jam sessions with local artists? Are they invested? Are they a part of some sort of secret elite order of musicians and craftsmen? Do they have any sort of official capacity in terms of the kingdom? Are bards like especially invested to be, you know, act as heralds and deliverers of news and speakers for the common folk and all that kind of stuff? If you want to be kind of cutesy and weird, you can kind of twist it almost into like some kind of musical lawyer kind of thing going on with them. There's lots of different ways to play with bards. It's just that in order for you know, your players to have a chance to, you know, play anything the way you want them to, you need to provide them examples. And bards, you know, I personally like bards. They're among my favorite classes. The fact that they cast magic, you know, implies that they're a cut above. So there should be that, you know, is that purely just some sort of natural genius that they just naturally just channel magic out of music? Is there something about the magical nature of the fantasy setting that various musical combinations are themselves capable of creating magic in some sort of like tonal kind of thing, like they do with the Dwemer in Skyrim? Are they part of some secret, you know, elite order of like elder, you know, herald skald types, and that are vested to be bards, and there's like a bunch of specific kind of heroic qualities that they're almost like paladins that use guitars instead of swords? Monks are, you know, they take a little thought. Because the name monk, there's a religious association that goes with that. But D&D's monks are not your Western European monastic, making hand-done copies of Bibles kind of monks. These are very much the Hong Kong Shaolin movie kind of stereotype that was popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So around the time all this stuff was being come up with, the idea that someone wanted to like throw a Kwai Chang Kang kind of characters into the middle of all this is like not unnatural, and it does in a weird way fit, surprisingly, despite the fact that so much of the rest of D&D isn't really necessarily framed through like Eastern mythology. There are times where narratively, depending on what kind of setting you're doing, they can stick out a little bit like a sore thumb. And in 5th edition, they're pulled even further away in some ways from like religious connections, kind of much similar to how paladins were done in this current version of D&D. And so you have to ask yourself, like, okay, if they're not necessarily directly associated with the same cults that druids and clerics are operating with, then why exactly are there monasteries? Who's financing this? If they're not incorporated into the dominant religious hierarchy as being, like, you have, your pope, your bishops, and all that, and in D&D you have, clerics, and then paladins, and then druids, and then warlocks, and then so on and so forth. Like, where do monks fit into that? And why are they training monks to, be masters of hand-to-hand combat? You need to figure that out, because if anyone's going to play a monk, they're going to have learned how to be a monk somewhere. And so somewhere in your setting, there's got to be at least one monastery that they have come from and learned at. And so why is that there, and who is it connected to? Who's paying for all these people to, live out there in a little fort out in the middle of nowhere? So, like, as with druids, if they're not incorporated into the dominant religious structure, or if the cult of Bahamut not only has knights of Bahamut who serve as paladins, but they also have monks of Bahamut. Why have both? What's been going on in the setting? A good chunk of like the whole mythology around the origins of that kind of style of over-the-top, flashy cinematic kung fu is after one of the various changes in dynasty had happened in China at one point. Weapons were banned in the common public. You're not allowed to have swords and military technology and all that kind of stuff. So people had to like start training in secret, at monasteries, kind of basically disguising themselves as like, oh, we're just Buddhist monks, leave us alone, kind of a thing. We're just practicing enlightenment, while secretly, they're learning to do like incredible punches and kicks and body flips and walk on top of bamboo reeds and all that other kind of stuff, and learn how to turn common farming implements into new weapons. That's a common stereotype about like the whole idea of like ninja in Japan, is that they were peasant farmer assassins, and like the reason why their weapons are strange is because they took a shovel and like heated it up and reshaped it, and that's why you got the weird like blades on top of a long pole. So why is that needed in your setting if that's the kind of common accepted narrative of what gives rise to a bunch of enlightened, religious, well-balanced, non-confrontational people who also can secretly kick a lot of ass? And I'm saying all this under the caveat that monk's probably my favorite class. If you like a vibe of where your style of play is that you largely sit back and try to listen a lot, and then you suggest a plan that absolutely nobody else at the table wants to go along with, and so you stay quiet and you go along with the stuff they want to do, and then in the middle of the fight, stuff gets bad. You're trying to not get into a combat, and then suddenly when you do get into a fight, you suddenly kick everything's butt. If you like that, playing that kind of character, the monk is pretty damn ideal. They're literally concerned about the welfare of the person that's trying to attack them, because they know that they have like the I can hit you 8 times in one round kind of thing going on. That monks bring to the table. They're a great class. It's just you got to figure out like who the fuck's training them. Paladins, I kind of touched on them a little bit. Of the various D&D classes, they are the most in line with their actual like classic conception. Apparently, like the original paladins were like Charlemagne's knights or something like that. And in role-playing games in general, they seem to have been elevated to being like like a holy knight kind of concept. Whether or not Charlemagne's, personal crew of hard hitters could, channel divine healing power through their hands or not, as I'm sure a subject of debate for many a historian. But in Dungeons and Dragons, that's been their vibe pretty much from the beginning. A fighter can be a regular knight. Anyone can swear an oath to a king and be given a castle and ride a horse and wear armor and all that kind of stuff. But the paladin is supposed to be the cut above. Up until 5th edition, they're pretty much always rooted in holy power. 5th edition has changed it because there's now like an oath thing. And I feel, the paladins still have the power. They can still do all the classic paladin stuff, and even more so because of the way 5th edition allows you to kind of almost soft multi-class as your character goes up in level, and depending on what kind of like subclass you choose and all that kind of stuff. But as I say, though, they're so functionally, in terms of their game crunch, the same in terms of how they would operate as how they've always been, that you can just real easily say that, okay, yeah, this is all oath-sworn shit, but that oath has to be is framed through one of these like pantheons or gods that are operating in your setting. Warlocks, another one of actually my favorite classes in many ways. They're more than one class in one. Despite being a magic user class, functionally in the society of the setting, I actually feel that they really should be classed amongst the divine classes, because they're channels of, speakers of, they're invested by supernatural evil or super mysterious obscure fey beings of yore, devils, eldritch beings, all sorts of wild and crazy kind of stuff. So it would seem that they are like the logical centerpiece for a lot of your evil cults that you would find in the world. That's why I frame them amongst the civilized, because yes, they can be randomly chosen by one of these beings, and so therefore you could also see them arise amongst the quote-unquote primitive societies. But in a way, it's less because they are a product of civilization. It's more that they kind of themselves potentially have a civilizing effect on those around them. I figured also, could maybe give a few more additional thoughts on how I personally would approach doing things like mages guilds and fighters guilds and such. If you're looking for a more, slightly gritty, real-world feeling kind of medieval setting, then most of your guilds wouldn't be for any of these things. They're going to be like carpenters guilds for certain specific kind of labor forces. They're in many ways just kind of a prototype precursor to, modern-day labor unions in their own kind of way. So a thing I personally like using them for is to be your banking operations in your setting. Characters, especially in Dungeons & Dragons, will accumulate a lot of gold and treasure, and even worse, tons of small denomination coins that they don't really want to carry around. Who wants to carry around 5,000 copper coins? You're not even really going to be spending them, because all the stuff you want to buy is measured in gold units, so you're going to have to find someone who can realistically exchange all this for them, so they can get like more condensed platinum coins, or switch it out for some precious gems that they can use as trade in place of heavier, denser, larger volumes of metal coins. And guilds are great for that, without having to like invent some sort of kind of like Hercules or Xena kind of thing going on, where you have too much of a modern nod going on in your medieval fantasy world. Thieves in specific, yes, thieves guilds on a global scale only really work if there is like a global civilization with consistent laws throughout the land. With most guilds, I feel like really they should be more kind of regional things. It's not like there is just one fighters guild and there is just one thieves guild. It's just various regions or cities or kingdoms that are organized enough and have enough of a grip on law enforcement and taxing and for the trade of various items across borders, and you're not allowed to bring certain things in, and why they feel that way. There actually has to be a need for criminal trade in order for there to be smuggling. Also, you need to have some amount of civilization going on with enough of a population density that you have a poor class that, might need to actually resort to thievery. I guess one of the key questions about having a thieves guild is how literal are you going to be taking that? Are we going for a Dickensian Oliver Twist Victorian London kind of thieves guild where it's like a bunch of orphans in the city who all meet in secret in a sewer cave, like Solo in Star Wars, a Solo. Where like some crooked old man, gives them orders and takes everything that they steal from them, and he just barely doles out a couple pences to them, and is secretly hoarding all the gold and promising that they'll get their share when they get old enough. Are we going to go with that kind of thieves guild where it's literally just a guild for thieves? Or is it called a thieves guild, but that's just kind of like a blanket term in the same way that we say gangs or mafia, when each and every one of these things is kind of like its own individual kind of thing in its own region. Some of them are more or less connected. In our own real world in modern times, the international syndicates and all that kind of stuff do exist, but we live in an international world, so it gives them room to breathe. But in Roman times, were there international smuggling rings taking stuff out of Colombia to Europe? No. Same thing would be going on in your D&D world. The level of thieves guildery going on in your setting is kind of in some ways like shadow to the level of civilization and all the negatives that come along with that. But you do need to consider some stuff like what is illegal in the various kingdoms that you're dealing with that would have a thieves guild in it. So, like what exactly is the criminal conduct? What kind of personal services might some of the people in the city might be offering that gets frowned on, or is that frowned on at all in the setting? I feel generally for most settings, thieves guilds are probably like centered purely within their own city. Maybe not even the entire kingdom. Like each major population center probably has its own thieves guild and might have its own name and have some little wiggle room in how they all operate. And they only really connect with each other through whatever kind of smuggling operations are necessary in order to be able to get things to and from regions that their ruling powers don't want those goods coming to or from, or they want to cut of the money of, and people don't want to have to pay that, so they're having to have it smuggled in or out. All that kind of stuff. That's what smuggling was back then. It was less about like trying to keep cocaine out of your country or anything like that. It was more about like, I want to charge you like an extra 400 gold coins if you want to sell your wool, and you want to sell your wool, so you're going to smuggle your wool in and just sell it off to somebody who's already been contacted and is going to buy it through all these various layers of connection. I kind of feel in some ways the Thieves Guild is kind of a nickname. It exists in that there's a bunch of thieves in your city and other criminals, and they know each other and help each other out and all that kind of stuff, but it's not like you have to sign up or anything. There's no one person in control of the whole thing. No one elects anybody. Everyone just does their thing. It could just, and it's just known as the Thieves Guild, just kind of like as a joke almost, a nickname. And that way the Thieves Guild both exists and doesn't exist at the same time. You can use all manner of real-world analogs: Yakuza, the Tongs, the Italian, Sicilian Mafia, Colombian cartels. Like it's all for grabs if you're looking for inspiration for whatever kind of criminal activity you want to be going on in your Dungeons & Dragons world. When you're coming up with homebrew settings and stuff, before you even get your players, since you don't know what they're going to play, you should at least have some notation on exactly what the crime life is like in your setting, in case someone does want to play a rogue and does want to lean more into the classic thief kind of archetype. Fighters guilds, I probably dislike them in concept the most, and also like Thieves Guilds, they're kind of everywhere in their own little ways already in the setting without having to have a Fighters Guild. That just kind of sounds like, some place where mercenaries and freelance warriors get quick jobs at. The Adventurers Guild and Goblin Slayer is probably a better model for what a Fighters Guild would operate as. It'd just be, like I said, like a nice place you can come and get some tea and wait in line to get your paperwork, and but like, is it actually being run and staffed by warriors itself? It could be like a bounty hunter kind of a posting thing put out by the kingdom. you know, your central kingdom, they, you know, there might be like a city guard. You might even have like some legal framework within the boundaries of like the immediate territory that that city-state has control of. There is a need, you know, to post bounties on various things that are kind of just slightly out of the immediate domain to send just random cutthroats to go handle. And so, you know, that's kind of what a realistic Fighters Guild could be in many ways. Like Fighters Guild, like, I guess implies that it's separate from the military training you'd get from joining an actual standing army or legion, or even like the kind of training that comes with becoming a city guardsman or anything like that. Like, if you want a really prominent presence of magic in your setting, it's a high magic setting, magic's common and everywhere, and you have magic schools, and magic is just another vocation that people can learn if they just have enough time and training and money to have gotten into those kinds of schools and kind of stuff. Then sure, magic guilds are okay. I feel more you could kind of use them as a framework, as just what the secret society of wizards in a more spread out kind of a wizardry setting, where, you know, the wizards are there and they're in communication with each other, and they do kind of, you know, like if you want to like share in the common, you know, talent pool and get help and all that kind of stuff. Like there might be some sort of fees and dues and a hierarchy and all that kind of stuff. You know, you can very much model mages guilds on occult conspiracy groups, and, you know, reference old movies and all kinds of stuff, Eyes Wide Shut or otherwise. I've always found the idea that every town has a mages guild. It's like, once again, it gets into those things where if you overpopulate too much wonderful stuff in your D&D setting, there is kind of an element I personally find, especially with early adventuring for starting level characters, is like, why are they needed to do the stuff they're doing when there's all these more powerful people all around who could be handling this way easier and not being at risk of being, you know, clawed to death by a kobold in the night, kind of level of adventuring. You know, it's a good chunk of why so many classic adventure modules and, you know, start off characters in little tiny towns out in the wilderness, because that puts them in a position where they are possibly the best fighter and wizard and all that available to these poor little townsfolk. So they're the only option available to stop the night kobolds that stalk them in the night of the night.
Stewards and Obstacles. The only tabletop role-playing game adventure that allows you to take on the role of stewards of the world's most inclusive role-playing game, to fight hateful content and fully monetize your players.
For use with the Total Party System Rules Handbook.
Available now on DriveThruRPG and Amazon.com.
I was rather happy when 5th edition first came out, and I'm still generally satisfied with it. It's kind of more the people surrounding it and working on the inside there that are kind of starting to raise my ire. But even then, I still, you know, find it a functional, potentially fun game, as long as you just listen to yourself about what you want to do with it instead of listening to what other people are telling you to do with it. And so I kind of missed out on exactly where the Dragonborn came from. You know, they were one of the core player races in the 4th edition Player's Handbook, and then on to being a core race in this one. I want to say they came from Eberron. Eberron like had like an almost Palladium-esque amount of races available in that setting. And since I wasn't around then, I'm not exactly clear, but I'm under the impression that Dragonborn originally came from the Eberron setting. And by making them a generic core race, that's caused, you know, like some ripple effects. The way they're written is so that, you know, like, you know, once upon a time, back in whatever ancient first age, during whatever, they're one of the first civilizations. They're up there with the first elves and the first dwarves. But in whatever war between elves and dragons and giants that had happened back then, the Dragonborn were the ones that actually got fucked the hardest. You know, their numbers decimated, their cities destroyed, and their race scattered to the winds. Seemingly maybe a little redundant, since there's also stuff like half-dragons and draconians already out there in the books. But okay, you know, when I first saw them, you know, I kind of, I don't know, like, this is kind of cheese dick, kind of a character. Like, who's this going to appeal to? It's going to appeal to power gamers who want to have a pretense around them that they're being somehow noble and virtuous by being the biggest and strongest and most powerful and undefeatable character ever kind of types. They seem almost built to be paladins. And, I don't know, I've tried to come up with some own ways in my own kind of homebrew type settings and stories to, try to kind of better fit them into things while not erasing or negating any of that kind of material that's in the printed backstory of them. I just advanced the timeline a little bit further on. My idea for using them is the cult of Io. For ages, the Dragonborn loyal to Tiamat and Dragonborn loyal to Bahamut have not liked each other, but some sort of event has happened in like the last century or so, which has brought the Knights of Bahamut and the cult of the dragon, aka the cult of Tiamat, together, and they're kind of creating like a dual cult of Io. They're not fully merged. The knights are still knights. The Tiamat cultists are serving as like the priesthood of this, but they're all dedicated on the idea that, if they can gain enough of a following, they'll be able to manifest Bahamut and Tiamat and then get them to remerge to bring the god, the dragon god, the original dragon creator god, Io, back to life somehow. Non-Dragonborn player characters and player character groups will maybe first encounter like a couple of Dragonborn monks or a Dragonborn scholar in town, maybe with like a kobold servant, maybe a couple of roaming Dragonborn knights who are seemingly helpful, and in all cases, seemingly like, oh, what potential great new allies we have here, not realizing that like back further east, the Dragonborn have been basically zipping across the land and kind of a crusade / inquisition kind of thing. The Dragonborn who belong to the cult of Io would start to change so that their scales would have both a chromatic and a metallic aspect, where the lead war priest of the cult of Io would be a Dragonborn dude with like the gold underscales like a gold dragon, but like maybe the green backing and arm scales and head scales of a green dragon kind of thing. You'd have kind of show that there's this emergent duality amongst them. The Dragonborn are like a looming future threat. After all this time, they're like on the cusp of becoming the next big empire again. They should be presented in such a way that player characters think, oh my god, these guys are helpful. We can get these guys to come help with our mission. They can bring in some firepower, so to say, and backing. Except that over time they should notice that, like when more Dragonborn start to enter their region, that that first they're seemingly focused on rooting out any little hidden cells of Cult of the Dragon that they haven't yet absorbed into the new Cult of Io. That's when you start to have your players notice that the somewhat harsh tactics, like they're capturing people, torturing them, making them confess. If they refuse to convert to the new Church of Io and they just remain loyal to the original cult of Tiamat, then they're being burned at a stake or crucified or whatever particular super harsh medieval punishment of choice that you would like to use. And it kind of like the slow dawning on your player characters that they've kind of invited a worse type of evil, because this is now the evil that thinks it's good. Also, I feel, especially because I like to include kobolds in that mix, it kind of frames kobolds as the dragon lineage version of the gnomes and halflings kind of a thing going on. They're the small race for that line. I kind of find it ironic to actually end up having them be like the source of a lot of technological innovations, like beyond that, even what like gnomes and dwarves have been producing. If I'm going to introduce, guns into the D&D setting, I'd have the kobolds be the one who invented them. Just a small army of thousands of kobolds with tiny little rifles. You can do some damage with that, and partly justified. That the idea that kobolds have been kind of just like living pretty primitive lives and still doing a lot of interesting little technological stuff anyway, in terms of like developing artificial wings for some of them, or all their intricate traps. They're not dumb. They just uneducated and starving. And so under the guidance of the Dragonborn and the Empire of Io, you have a couple generations of kobolds emerge who've been fed and educated, and so therefore, even though they're still themselves the leaps of innovation and invention that they're able to come up with like, you know, jump exponentially compared to earlier. In fact, it could also be a interesting and unexpected twist for a new origin point for reintroducing Spelljammer technology into your setting or something like that. If we're gonna have the Dragonborn in there, like, they should be a bigger presence. Like, they're pretty buff race, even with the stuff they've done in 5th edition to kind of balance them out more, where they're not so, like, you know, automatically going to get wings and all that kind of shit. I feel like they should have more of an impact on the setting, and the way they've been integrated in many of the established settings that Dungeons & Dragons has done is, like, I don't know, I haven't felt entirely satisfied with it. So at least if you're doing a homebrew thing, you construct something that also plays into the idea that, like, you know, we're not familiar, even now, we're still kind of not familiar as a gaming culture with having Dragonborn in our D&D settings. I mean, anytime you go back and look at any of the old D&D stuff, not a whiff of them at all. They didn't even exist. There should be a way to, like, both play into the idea that they're old, but also, like, they're a new threat. They're a forgotten thing from the past that's now returning, and because they're so ill-remembered, the nature of the threat that they pose is kind of, like, over everyone's heads, and it takes some time for the players to realize that, you know, oh, this was a mistake. We should not have allied with these people and help them, bring them into our little starting, you know, adventure area, because, you know, now they're going to persecute everyone in the city and burn them alive if they don't convert, ourselves included. I'm going to talk a bit about sidekicks. In the last D&D campaign I had ran, that had lasted of any length, I'd started it off using the Essentials kit the day after I bought it, and over time kind of started weaving my own stuff into it. But from the get-go, I was curious to try out the sidekick dynamics, and through my experimentation, I guess I have some advice and tips on how to use them. I also feel that the concept works well with other kind of games too, especially games that, like, have a higher danger threshold and you have a smaller player group, so, you know, to have a little additional backup when going into combat encounters and all that other kind of stuff, or a need for special skills that none of the players have because they didn't take those kinds of character classes. Sidekicks can help fill in a lot of blanks. The key is that they're not a second character. What I like to do is to, you know, in terms of what the sidekick as an NPC knows, and how they will respond to character questions and all that other kind of stuff, I leave that and operate that like a regular NPC. But in terms of the tactical control of that NPC's stats and how it's used in combat situations, I'll cede that to whichever player wants to have control over that sidekick in any given scenario. I don't necessarily, like, have it be permanently partnered, you know, like, this character has this sidekick, unless there's some, like, you know, in-game story narrative reason why they go together. Generally, I think they should be used to be switched in and out. Over time, you know, players become more attached to them, especially, you know, in part because those sidekick NPCs will kind of siphon some of the XP points that they've been getting in their encounters. And so after a time, like, you want to keep developing this one because you've already dumped so much XP loss into it in order to get it to level 2, that, you know, it gives the players, like, a rules-based subconscious reason to want to stick to some sidekicks and keep going back to them. But they should be encountering optional sidekicks in most, like, places they go that are important to whatever the overall adventure narrative is. Use them as something that can be unlocked, almost like in a way like you see in, like, you know, some video games like Elder Scrolls, where, you know, like, sometimes, yeah, some sidekicks might be available just because they're mercenary and you got the coin, and they'll, you know, follow along and help you fight the thing in the cave. Types of characters they might befriend and win over to their side. NPCs that have a shared common cause, that have a reason to want to go along just for this one mission or set of missions. All that kind of stuff make, you know, good excuses to have NPCs that suddenly the players are more invested in because they're helping to control them, and they feel like a second character to them, even though they don't get to speak for them. Also, in case of character death, the sidekicks are a good like immediate standby, so that the player can still be participating in what's going on, because they just take full control of the sidekick, even though they don't still necessarily know what all that sidekick knows, and they would still be encouraged to make a new character as opposed to just completely taking over the sidekick as their own player character. But because of how sidekicks are designed, it's real easy to just switch them over to a standard class, and boom, you know, you got your replacement character right there on hand. I find they're really great for cold opens. If you're in the middle of some ongoing stuff, and your player characters into the last session, they're in the woods traveling to whatever, and so the next session's going to start off with, well, they're just off in the woods, and unless you have some dumb made up reason why a bunch of kobolds come roaring out of the forest to attack them at their camp right when they first wake up at dawn. It could lead to kind of like a boring, you're exactly where you left off, so I guess you're going to keep walking through the woods, right? That's kind of a lame opening. But if there's sidekick characters that they have met and used and are, back behind, they didn't come along with them on what they're currently doing, or if there's sidekicks that they haven't yet met or realized that they were potentially unlockable sidekick characters, you can have an action-packed starting cold open. The players get to control some sidekick characters just for the scene, and it's just to show that oh my God, some sort of nefarious stuff is going on back at the town, while we're away, trying to find the mountain, kind of a scenario going on. That the players, as the audience, get to have this tension the entire time now that their characters are dicking around on this mission, that all this horrible stuff is going back in the town, especially if you don't do it too often, just to imply that something bad's happening, but that you don't then just keep showing them scene after scene, yet they have to wait the entire time it takes them to finish what they're doing and then get all the way back to town to then discover what has transpired. Optionally, also, you could use that as a way to have one of the sidekicks come out and fetch the player characters to bring them back prematurely in case, because they hadn't fully finished some earlier scenario. It has allowed some evil to be unleashed on NPCs they have come to care about. And like I said, as players over time start to realize that this is going on and that different NPCs could potentially become companion-type characters, at least in brief, they become kind of, more invested in NPCs in general and more interested in trying to be, make friends with them. Sometimes this might lead to you oh, well, this actually on the fly might actually make a good companion character because this seems, all just natural to how the storyline is evolving. You just throw in the basic template, and you're good to go. In the Essentials kit game I ran, I found the players were so attached to one of their sidekicks, Pickled Pete, who I had made into a gnome. He was like their guide to get them to the little gnome town on the side of the mountain where there's the mimic loose in the halls or some sort of thing like that. It's basically the Thing with gnomes, because they're all paranoid of everything now and each other. And on the way back, they encountered Cryovane, and instead of having them try to fight Cryovane at such an early level, I just decided to cheap out and had Cryovane just snatch the gnome off the back of their cart and fly away. Which I felt it shows them the sting of Cryovane without wiping out the party, because they rolled a Cryovane encounter that early on. They were so touched by all that, they actually gave Pickled Pete a funeral.